Good evening. This is Atheist History Week, and I'm John Rafferty, President of the Secular Humanist Society of New York, and also a proud and active member of New York City Atheists, which produces this show. Each week at this time, we look at the week's anniversaries in the history of free thought, of atheism, agnosticism, secularism, humanism, rationalism, skepticism, what have you-ism. We discuss notable people, the famous, some not so famous, some infamous, who were born or died or achieved something during this week in history. We also look at events that took place at this time, this week in history, publishing dates, premieres of famous plays, of all kinds of congresses and meetings that took place, and of course religious fun and games like pogroms and burnings at the stake and other faith-based initiatives. We're up to the last week in October, as are you. We are facing those dates from October 22nd to October 31st. And let's begin with the biggest name we have this week, the first Vice President of the United States ever, and the second Vice President of the United States ever, and the father of the sixth President of the United States. Of course, we're talking about John Adams, who was born October 30th in 1735. Was John Adams an atheist? No. Was he a free thinker? You betcha, he certainly was. And he had a few things to say about Christianity. He and Abigail, who's almost as famous as he is, were Unitarians. Unitarians, if you don't realize it, are people who simply think that the idea of the Trinity of three gods in one makes no logical sense, and that God is singular, a unity, a Unitarian. I only bring that up because about 50 years before, if John and Abigail had professed that in Massachusetts, they might have been hanged. Certainly no, very active in the formation of the United States of America. He was one of our founding fathers. And so when people try to tell you that our founding fathers were trying to we're establishing a Christian nation, don't believe it. Adams, like many others of our founding fathers, were either Unitarians or deists or both. Not many of them were Christians. Some of them were. After the Revolution and after the establishment of the nation, and afterwards when he served, after his retirement, he worked at the Massachusetts Constitutional Conventions of both 1779 and 1820 to fighting for the separation of church and state. Remember, Massachusetts, where the Pilgrims came from, where the Salem witch trials took place, where church and state were still bound together even after the United States of America was formed. Finally, the church and state were separated, but that was after Adams died. The question, he wrote in a letter to Jefferson, the question before the human race is whether the God of nature shall govern the world by his own laws, or whether priests and kings shall rule it by fictitious miracles. Adams, as I say, was not an atheist, but he was a free thinker, and one of the things that he loathed was the rule of priests and bishops and other clergy. He wanted no part of them, and lived his life without them. The United States of America have exhibited, perhaps, he wrote, the first example of governments erected on the simple principles of nature. And if men are now sufficiently enlightened to disabuse themselves of artifice, imposture, hypocrisy, and superstition, they will consider this event as an era in their history. What event? The formation of the United States, built on the principles of nature, not on God, not on the Bible. Continuing the Adams quote, though the detail of the formation of the American governments is at present little known or regarded either in Europe or in America, it may hereafter become an object of curiosity. It will never be pretended that any persons employed in that service, meaning the formation of the United States, had interviews with the gods or were in any degree under the influence of heaven, more than those at work upon ships or houses, or laboring in merchandise or agriculture. It will forever be acknowledged that these governments were contrived merely by the use of reason and the senses. Don't let anybody tell you that the United States was founded on Christian or biblical principles. On October 31st in 1795, the Romantic poet John Keats was born. Tough childhood. Father died when he was not even 10 years old. His mother died of tuberculosis a few years later. He went to college and his surgery classes, going to be a doctor, but he spent his time, instead of taking notes, writing poetry. He published his first long poem, Endymion, when he was just 21. And he's written some of those poems which have lasted and are very, very popular in the English language, like Ode to a Nightingale, an Ode on a Grecian Urn. He himself contracted tuberculosis, and he was depressed pretty much by a thwarted romance with a young woman who considered him too poor to be marriageable. And his tuberculosis resulted in a year-long, drawn-out death scene. Tortured, terrible. He ended his days in Italy. He stayed away from religious ritual of any kind. And his opinion of religion is best summed up in a poem that is not included in many of your middle school anthologies of romantic poetry. It's called Sonnet Written in Disgust of Vulgar Superstition. The church bell toll, let me start again. The church bells toll a melancholy round, calling the people to some other prayers, some other gloominess, more dreadful cares, more hearkening to the sermon's horrid sound. Surely the mind of man is closely bound in some black spell, seeing that each one tears himself from fireside joys and Lydian airs and converse high of those with glory crowned. Still, still they toll, and I should feel a damp, a chill as from a tomb, did I not know that they are dying like an outburned lamp, that 'tis their sighing, wailing, ere they go into oblivion, that fresh flowers will grow and many glories of immortal stamp. In disgust of vulgar superstition, Keats's vision of the end of religion. Religion is a means of exploitation employed by the strong against the weak. Religion is a cloak of ambition, injustice, and vice. Truth breaks free, science is popularized, and religion totters. Soon it will fall. In the course of centuries, that is, tomorrow. In good time, we shall only have to deal with reason. So wrote Georges Bizet. The composer, who was born October 25th in 1838. And oh, if only what he had predicted had come true. Bizet was a musical prodigy who could have had a career as a concert pianist, but he wanted to write. And so he did. He wrote about 30 operas, none of which was particularly successful, until he came across Prosper Mérimée book about a Spanish gypsy girl and wrote the opera Carmen. Carmen was very controversial for its time. For one thing, it wasn't about kings and queens or the gods. It was about a gypsy girl who worked in a cigarette factory, and the soldier, a private no less, who was her erstwhile lover, who was dumped, and so it was not your standard, not your ordinary opera. And also, not only its humble subject matter and its passionate sweep. I mean, these were earthly emotions that were coming out, not God speaking down from Olympus. Also, it was written in French, and that meant that the audience could understand what the singers were singing. It was considered a horrible idea. Anyway, received only lukewarm attention, and Bizet died of a heart attack 3 months after the premiere of Bizet, of Carmen, never knowing that it would go on to become the most popular and most produced ever opera in the canon. Bizet was a rationalist. He struggled with his religious and philosophical views as a young man, and he fought against writing religious materials, commissions. He was offered commissions to write religious materials, and he turned them down. Died at a very young age, but as we know, a rationalist and a free thinker. A death date comes up in the next person we're thinking about. October 27th, 1553, Michael Servetus. Went to the stake and was burned alive in Geneva, Switzerland. He was executed for heresy by order of John Calvin. Calvin, the great reformer. When you hear John Calvin's name, you hear he was the great reformer. Well, yeah, he was one of those Protestant so-called reformers who got rid of some of the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church, but he picked up on the real hateful stuff like burnings at the stake. That he thought was a good idea. Servetus was one of those people who said the Trinity just doesn't make sense. It's not logical, and God should be logical. And if I'm speaking more about Calvin here than Servetus, is because this really is about Calvin. They knew each other as young men. They were not great friends, but they were acquaintances. Servetus studied with Calvin. They knew each other. And Servetus would write his religious ideas. He was a doctor. And he would write out his religious ideas and send them to Calvin as a friend. Look what I'm thinking. And Calvin turned right around and used them to have Servetus arrested. And as a matter of fact, he had Servetus arrested by the Catholic Inquisition. Calvin was a rotter. He really stunk. And he had Michael Servetus, whose sin was free thinking, burned at the stake on October 27th in 1553. On October 27th in 1782, NICCOLO Paganini was born. Paganini is not a famous atheist or freethinker. However, he led, as one of his biographers wrote, a religion-free life, and he refused the sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church on his deathbed for 1840 in Italy. That's, a big deal. And he demanded that there would be no religious ritual at his burial. But what was interesting when I was reading about this was he had to face a problem all his life because of the religious imbeciles of Italy and Europe, and just as they are all over the place. Paganini made his first public appearance as a violinist at the age of 11, and he was appointed first violinist at the Lucca court very shortly thereafter. As a youth, Paganini practiced up to 15 hours a day, which made it possible for him to play with a virtuosity and a speed and an intricacy that nobody else could. So, probably fostered by other violinists who were his competitors on the circuit, so to speak, Paganini was hounded by accusations all through his life that he had made a pact with the devil to play the violin so well. Well, of course, people who appreciated the violin kept hiring him. So, on October 27th in 1844, KLAS PONTUS ARNOLDSON was born in Gothenburg, Sweden, a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1908 for his pacifist work. There was the great separation in 1895 of the union between Norway and Sweden, and he was one of the people who served on the commissions that split a country peacefully. This doesn't happen very often. We were just talking about last week about the bloodshed of 2 million people when India and Pakistan separated. Bloodless separation of Norway and Sweden. Although there were a lot of people who said, over my dead body, a few rationalists and pacifists worked it out, and the countries were separated without bloodshed. Arnoldson was a Unitarian, a freethinker. He wrote and spoke often on against fanatic dogmatism. There was, back then, late 19th century, Sweden was a hotbed of fundamentalism. And Arnoldson wrote and spoke on the freedom of the individual conscience, on tolerance and freedom of thought. He wrote several major works during towards the end of his life, including a book called Religion in the Light of Research, which I cannot say that I've read. I don't even know if it's translated. Doris Lessing was born on October 22nd in 1919. And I wish I could say that I was more familiar with her work than I am, but I've only attempted a couple of her science fiction novels, and I found them very difficult to understand. However, Doris Lessing in 1962 published The Golden Notebook, which is an early feminist classic. A couple of women in my life who said that the Golden Notebook changed their lives. Doris Lessing was born in Persia, it was called then, which is of course now Iran, to British parents, and she moved with them to the British colony of Southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and she had this wonderful, idyllic childhood in the African savannas or veldt, I don't know what. But it ended when her parents decided she should go to convent school, where she was literally terrified by the nuns and their tales of sin and damnation. She nevertheless got a temporary attraction to Roman Catholicism, probably from being there in the school, except that her mother, probably realizing the mistake she had made in sending young Doris off to a convent school, read her descriptions of the horrors of the Inquisition. And so Doris, in her own words, quit religion, quote unquote. She has been she's written several coming-of-age novels which have been widely condemned for their feminism, essentially. And she was even called a prohibited alien by Southern Rhodesia and South Africa back in the apartheid days. You never believe, she once wrote, when I was young, we genuinely believed religious wars were over. We'd say, at least it's impossible to have a religious war now. Can you believe that? I'm so afraid of religion. Its capacity for murder is terrifying. There are certain types of people, she wrote, who are political out of a kind of religious reason. I think it's fairly common among socialists. They are in fact God seekers, looking for the kingdom of God on earth. If you don't believe in heaven, then you believe in socialism. By the way, did I mention that she won the 2007 Nobel Prize for Literature? She did. Let's just mention, born October 25th in 1827, was Pierre Eugene Marcelin Berthelot. The founder, pretty much, of organic chemistry. He was one of the first to produce organic compounds synthetically, and he demonstrated that chemical phenomena are not governed by any peculiar law, subject only to chemicals. That they weren't God directed. He was won the Legion of Honor, elected to the Academy of Sciences, and also was an honorary associate of the Rationalist Press Association. He would listen to no compromise whatever with religion, wrote one of the his biographers. Edward Truelove was born on October 29th in 1809, and is best known for publishing rationalist books and pamphlets. Published Voltaire's Philosophical Dictionary and Thomas Paine's writings. Edward Truelove, born in England on October 29th in 1809. By the way, he did some prison time for advocating birth control. Who else? Born the last week in October, October 25th, 1933. Me. Okay? I'm John Rafferty, the president of the Secular Humanist Society of New York, and as I said at the beginning of the show, a proud and active member as well of New York City Atheists, which produces this show, which will be back here again next week, the first week in November, and I hope you'll be with us. We'll have some interesting people to talk about then. Thank you for watching tonight. Good night.
Wherever we once were, we are no longer a Christian nation, at least not just. We are also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, and a Buddhist nation, and a Hindu nation, and a nation of non-believers.